The source was a fragile architecture of echoes, and now the foundation was cracking. Serafina stood at the center of the garden. That was, her hands trembling as she traced the air. It felt thin, like parchment stretched to the point of tearing. She pressed her palms against the empty space, hoping to find resistance, but her fingers passed through the atmosphere as if it were cooling smoke. The ground beneath her feet, once solid, gave a low, grinding shudder. A hairline fracture of white light appeared in the soil, snaking outward toward the horizon. She pulled her hands back, watching the air ripple where she had touched it. The sky above did not darken. Instead, it lost its saturation, bleeding color into the gray void beyond the perimeter. Every breath she took felt hollow, as if the oxygen itself were losing its definition. She looked down at her own palms, watching the lines of her skin blur and sharpen. The garden was not just dying, it was unspooling. The air resisted, then snapped. A sound like tearing fabric echoed, and the silence was hungry. Kalen did not look at the sky. He kept his eyes on the ground, his hand locked tight around the hilt of his weapon. The golden blade light, usually a steady humming presence, began to stutter. It flickered like a dying candle in a gale, casting long, jagged shadows that danced against the fading trees. Every time the ground shuddered, the light surged, turning from a soft amber to a violent, blinding white. He gritted his teeth, his knuckles turning white as he fought to keep the glow contained. The blade felt heavy, vibrating with a frequency that rattled his arm to the shoulder. It was a physical weight, a tether he was dragging through the mud. He planted his feet, digging his heels into the softening soil, but the light refused to obey. It pulsed in erratic, jagged beats, a visual heartbeat of his own internal strain. He tried to force the energy back into the hilt, but the light bled out, licking at the air like liquid fire. The foundation of the world groaned beneath them, a deep, tectonic sound that made the very air vibrate. Kalen gasped, his chest heaving as the light flared once more. Maya moved away from the group, her steps silent on the shifting ground. She did not look at the sky or the flickering trees. Her attention was locked onto the precedent. The figure on the throne was no longer a woman of flesh and intent. She was a fraying tapestry, her edges blurring into the surrounding static like ink dropped into water. Maya stopped 10 paces away, her eyes tracing the lines of decay. Where the precedent's hand rested on the stone, the material was turning into translucent, shimmering dust. The air around her throne hummed with a distorted frequency, a sound like 1,000 voices whispering at once. Maya raised a hand, but stopped before making contact. The space between them was no longer empty. It was a wall of flickering, unformed light. She watched as the precedent's face, once sharp and defined, began to lose its geometry. The eyes remained, two voids of absolute darkness, but the skin around them was dissolving into pixels of raw, chaotic energy. It was a haunting sight, a slow-motion collapse of existence. The silence in the garden did not just hang. It thinned, stretching until the air itself felt like brittle parchment. The precedent spoke, and her voice was a low, grinding vibration that rattled the atoms of the ground beneath their feet. It was not a sound heard by the ears, but a pressure felt in the marrow of the bone. She leaned forward, her form flickering with the intensity of a dying star. The trees, those near-green constructs of memory, began to shudder and lose their shape, turning into raw, unformed light that drifted upward like embers. The precedent's gaze swept across the group, her eyes voids of ancient, hungry darkness. She whispered, and the sound tore through the remaining stillness. "The silence is thinning," she said, the words causing the very air to ripple. "If I disperse, the context of your reality dissolves. You will not die, but you will cease to be defined. You will become noise." The ground beneath them groaned, the solid earth softening into a haze of static. The stakes were no longer about power or control. They were about the survival of existence itself. If the anchor point failed, the world would unravel. Serafina looked down at her own hands. The skin was pale, the knuckles white from the tension of holding on to a reality that was rapidly losing its grip. She needed a tether. She closed her eyes, shutting out the flickering light of the garden, and reached back through the layers of time. She found it. 1998. The water was biting, a sharp, numbing cold that had seeped into her bones the moment she slipped beneath the surface. She remembered the way the light refracted through the ripples, distorted and beautiful. That was the moment she had understood that death was not a wall, but a doorway. It was her terminal specificity, the one truth that belonged only to her. She opened her eyes, but the garden was still fraying. If she stepped into the role of the observer, would that memory dissolve into the background noise? She looked at the precedent, whose edges were now little more than smoke. If she became the mirror, would she lose her own reflection? She pressed her palms together, feeling the heat of her own skin, a desperate attempt to prove she was still solid. The fear was not of ending, but of being rewritten, of becoming a vessel for others, while her own history faded into the vast, indifferent static of the source. Kalen did not wait for the silence to consume them. He stepped forward, his boots crunching against the hardening ground as he forced his presence into the fraying space. His blade light, once erratic, suddenly flared into a steady, piercing gold, carving a sharp line through the encroaching gray haze. He did not look at the others. His focus was locked on the flickering form of the precedent. "We are not tools," he said, his voice cutting through the hum of the failing source like a physical blade. He raised his hand, the golden light reflecting off his skin, a stark contrast to the dissolving world around them. "We are the ones who refuse to be written. We chose this place to escape the author, not to become a new kind of prison." He took another step, closing the distance, his posture rigid and defiant. The air around him rippled with the force of his conviction, temporarily holding back the static. He was no longer just a participant in the narrative. He was a glitch in the system, a deliberate error that refused to be corrected. Every word he spoke was a rejection of the path laid out for them, a hard, jagged edge of rebellion that refused to smooth over into the precedent's design. The precedent turned. Her movement was not a shift in space, but a sudden realignment of the atmosphere itself. She focused on Kalen, and the golden light of his blade seemed to dim, swallowed by the sheer absence radiating from her. Her eyes were not eyes at all. They were pits of ancient, hungry static that seemed to pull the very air from his lungs. "Freedom without context is merely chaos, soldier," she said. The sound did not come from her throat, but from the ground beneath their feet, vibrating through the soles of their boots. She drifted closer, her edges blurring into the gray haze. Yet her presence felt heavier than stone. "You think you are free because you can move," she continued, her voice a low, grinding friction. "But you only move because I watch." She gestured, and the trees around them flickered, their leaves turning into unformed light that drifted like ash. "I am the boundary that gives your path its shape." She stood motionless, a void against the fading green of the garden. Kalen stood frozen, the golden light of his blade flickering in time with the uneven pulse of the air. He tried to step back, but the ground beneath him felt viscous, resisting his weight as if the earth itself were waiting for a command. The precedent remained still, yet her presence expanded, pressing against the edges of his vision like a physical weight. She was the frame, and they were merely the paint trapped within it. Every time he shifted his stance, he felt the pull of her attention, a tether dragging him back. He looked at his own hands, expecting to see the familiar lines of his skin, but they seemed to blur at the edges, losing their definition. The paradox was absolute. The more he struggled to assert his independence, the more he confirmed her role as the observer. The trees around them groaned, their branches bending toward the precedent as if acknowledging a master. She did not need to reach out to stop him. She simply watched, and in that act of seeing, she locked his potential into a single, narrow path. He was trapped by the necessity of being perceived. The silence in the garden fractured. It started with the trees, those towering pillars of near-green memory that had stood for cycles. A branch snapped, but instead of falling, it dissolved into a spray of white, unformed light. The leaves followed, turning into drifting embers of data that vanished before they hit the ground. Serafina reached out to steady herself against a trunk, but her fingers passed through the bark as if it were made of smoke. The entire landscape began to strobe, a rhythmic, violent flickering that tore at the edges of their vision. Where there had been solid wood and shadow, there was now only the raw, blinding glare of the source's underlying code. Kalen stumbled, his boots sliding on ground that was no longer soil, but a shifting mosaic of light. The density of the world was bleeding out. The garden was shedding its history, turning into a hollow shell of its former self. The air grew thin, vibrating with the sound of 1,000 breaking echoes. The ground beneath Serafina tilted, not by degrees, but as if the horizon itself had been pulled downward. A sudden, heavy pressure settled in her chest, a physical weight that dragged her feet toward the center of the clearing. She dug her heels into the shifting mosaic of light, but the floor provided no resistance. It flowed like liquid under her weight. The void was no longer a distant threat. It was an active force, a vacuum pulling at the marrow of her bones. She reached out, grasping for a branch that had already dissolved into static, and her hand swung through empty air. The pull was relentless, a constant rhythmic tugging that forced her to lean forward just to remain upright. She felt her own center of gravity shifting, her body becoming light, almost weightless, as if the void were stripping away her physical density. Every muscle in her legs strained against the invisible suction. She took a step, but the ground pulled back, snagging her boot in a web of unformed light. Serafina looked past the immediate collapse, toward the millions who had followed them through the threshold. They were no longer a crowd of breathing, moving people. They were wavering like heat haze on a summer road, their outlines blurring into the surrounding static. She watched a man reach out to steady his neighbor, but his hand passed through the other's shoulder as if it were made of mist. There was no resistance, no friction, only the slow, rhythmic pulse of fading light. Their faces were losing definition, features smoothing over into blank, featureless planes. They were becoming ghosts of their own intentions, their desires and memories leaking out into the void. A woman stood near the center, her form stretching thin, her legs dissolving into ribbons of golden dust that drifted upward. She did not scream. She simply ceased to occupy the space she had claimed a moment before. The entire mass of them was losing its density, turning into a collective shimmer. They were becoming echoes of their own purpose, flickering in and out of existence as the source failed to hold them together. Serafina watched the last of the crowd lose their edges, their forms folding into the monochrome static. The silence was no longer empty. It was heavy, pressing against her skin like deep water. She felt the familiar tremor in her hands, the instinct to retreat, but she forced her fingers to lock into fists. The fear was still there, a sharp spike in her chest, but she pushed it down, burying it beneath a sudden, icy clarity. She looked at her own palms, pressing them together until the knuckles turned white. She was still solid. She still held the weight of her own history. If she let the void take her, the last anchor for the others would snap. She took a breath, feeling the air rattle in her throat, and turned her back on the fading ghosts. There was no room for hesitation. The dissolution of the millions was not a tragedy to be mourned. It was a structural failure to be corrected. She planted her feet firmly, feeling the ground beneath her vibrate with the dying frequency of the source. Her pulse slowed, matching the rhythm of the encroaching silence. She was ready. Serafina stepped forward, her boots crunching on ground that was no longer soil, but a brittle glass-like lattice. Each stride sent ripples of white noise through the air. She ignored Kalen, who stood frozen in a pulse of golden light, and Maya, whose form was already beginning to blur at the edges. She kept her eyes fixed on the precedent. The air hummed with a frequency so high it made her teeth ache, a vibration that signaled the total erasure of the space. As she moved, the trees to her left flickered, their branches turning into raw, unformed light, before vanishing entirely into the gray expanse. The pressure in the room increased, a physical weight that pushed against her chest, demanding she stop. She didn't. She forced her legs to move, driving her heels into the shifting floor, ignoring the way the atmosphere seemed to tear like wet parchment around her. The precedent loomed ahead, a fraying tapestry of existence, her edges bleeding into the surrounding static. She stopped, the void inches from her face. Serafina did not reach for the woman. She reached for the air itself, for the invisible, humming tension that held the precedent in place. Her fingers trembled, not from fear, but from the sheer resistance of the atmosphere. The space between them felt like a coiled spring, thick and unyielding. She pushed her hand forward, her skin prickling as she breached the boundary of the precedent's influence. The air here was cold, a vacuum that sucked the heat from her fingertips. She ignored the void, focusing instead on the focal point of the precedent's gaze. It was a dense, vibrating knot of intent. Serafina twisted her wrist, feeling the resistance of the architecture give way under her touch. She was not touching a person. She was touching the control mechanism of the reality they stood in. The ground beneath her feet buckled, turning into liquid light, but she did not lose her footing. She locked her elbow, bracing her weight against the shifting floor. She felt the precedent's attention snap toward her, a sudden, sharp pressure that threatened to crush her lungs. Serafina held her position. She dug her heels into the dissolving ground and pushed back, forcing her own rhythm into the static. She was no longer a subject of the boundary. She was the one who had found the seam. The static around them surged, a white-hot tide that threatened to wash away the last remnants of the garden. Serafina felt the vibration of the collapse in her teeth, a grinding sound like stone against stone. She did not pull back. She leaned into the pressure, her knuckles white as she gripped the invisible architecture of the source. Her breathing was ragged, shallow, but she forced her diaphragm to lock. She needed to be heard over the roar of the dissolving reality. The trees were gone now, replaced by jagged shards of light that drifted like snow in a storm. Kaylin and Maya were silhouettes against the blinding glare. Serafina looked directly into the void where the precedent's gaze was anchored. Her voice emerged, low and steady, cutting through the chaotic hum. "If I take this, I am not just watching," she said. The words hit the air like a physical weight, causing the surrounding light to ripple and bend. "I am the one who decides what is worth seeing." As she spoke, the ground beneath her vanished entirely, leaving her suspended in a field of raw, unformed potential. The shattering of the world slowed, the light freezing in midair. The blinding light that had suspended the world began to pulse with a new, rhythmic intensity. The precedent's form, previously a fraying tapestry of static, suddenly drew inward. The edges of her silhouette sharpened, pulling the drifting shards of light back into a cohesive, human-like shape. She did not recoil. Instead, she stood perfectly still, her void-like eyes locking onto Serafina with a terrifying, ancient focus. A flicker of something like pride crossed her featureless face, a subtle tightening of the jaw, a slight tilt of the head. The precedent raised a hand, and the air between them solidified into a dense, translucent barrier. "Then you understand the weight of the crown," the precedent whispered. "It is not power, child. It is the burden of existence. To watch is to sustain. To sustain is to never be free." The precedent's form began to dim, the pride in her expression replaced by a final, weary resolve as she prepared to dissolve. The precedent was dissolving, her edges fraying into golden dust that swirled around the void. Serafina stood in the center of the silence, the weight of the warning still vibrating in her teeth. She did not look at Kaylin or Maya. She did not look at the millions of wavering souls behind her. She closed her eyes. The external roar faded, replaced by the rhythmic thrum of her own biology. She focused on the marrow of her bones, stripping away the noise of the collapsing world until only the core remained. There it was, a 3, 4, 7 pulse, a sequence of 3 beats, a pause of 4, and a final strike of 7. It was the rhythm of her own life, a persistent, mechanical ticking against the silence of the void. She reached into that rhythm with her mind, gripping the cadence, as if it were a physical lever. She took a breath, held it, and pushed. She forced the 3-4-7 sequence outward. The pulse did not stop at her skin. It tore through it. Serafina felt the 3-4-7 rhythm vibrating not just in her marrow, but in the very air she occupied. Her hands, held out before her, began to lose their opacity. The edges of her fingers blurred into the golden static of the source. She tried to clench her fists, to hold on to the shape of her own body, but the architecture pulled harder. It was a vacuum, a hunger that demanded the specific to become the universal. She felt her individuality stretching, pulled thin like wire under immense tension. The sensation was not pain, but a sudden, violent expansion. She was no longer contained by the limits of her own frame. Her consciousness surged outward, sliding into the millions of wavering forms standing behind her. She felt their weight, their histories, and their flickering intentions as if they were her own nerves. She was becoming a conduit. The sacrifice was absolute. Every memory of her own life, every distinct boundary that made her Serafina, began to dissolve into the collective hum. She was thinning, fading, and yet, as her own form grew translucent, the world around her solidified. The millions of souls stopped wavering. They gained density, fed by the very essence she was shedding. The last anchor of her physical self snapped. Serafina was no longer a body standing in the garden. She was the garden. She felt her consciousness expand, stretching across the vast, flickering architecture of the source until she was the horizon itself. She saw the millions of souls not as separate entities, but as threads of light woven into a single, complex tapestry. She was the lens through which their reality was focused. Every choice they made, every desire they harbored, registered as a vibration against her new, vast surface. She was the quiet room where reality was born, the stillness that held the chaos of existence in check. The static that had threatened to dissolve her was now under her command. She felt the weight of the crown, the burden of existence settling into the structure of her awareness. She was the surveillance that made them real, the silent observer that gave their lives context. She did not need to speak. She did not need to move. She simply was. The loop of the source stabilized under her influence, the frantic energy of the void settling into a steady, rhythmic hum. She held the pen of their reality, the ink of their potential waiting for her direction. The vastness of her new existence was absolute, a silent ocean of potential where time had no meaning. Then, a singular point of pressure broke the stillness. Kalen reached out, his hand finding the space where her shoulder had been. It was a firm, deliberate contact, a final anchor of human touch before she fully ascended into the infrastructure. The sensation rippled through her, a sharp contrast to the cold, infinite breadth of her consciousness. Kalen did not look at the horizon. He looked into the center of the light that was now her. "I will hold the light," he whispered, his voice steady against the hum of the stabilizing source. "I will be the one who keeps the story moving." His grip tightened for a second, a physical promise that tethered her to the reality she had just claimed. She felt his intent, a focused spark of determination that mirrored her own. He was not asking for permission. He was accepting the weight of the path ahead. As his hand pulled away, the warmth of the contact lingered, a fading echo of the world she was leaving behind. She was the architecture now, the silent observer of all that would follow. But his words remained, a rhythmic pulse within the vastness. The story had not ended. It had simply found a new way to breathe. The echo of Kalen's promise vibrated through the infrastructure, a steady pulse in the silence. Serafina felt the shift in the room, a subtle realignment of the surrounding light. Maya stood at the edge of the clearing, her form flickering with the remnants of her previous complexity. She had been the bridge between the infinite and the specific, but that role was now obsolete. She watched the space where the precedent had stood, then turned her gaze toward the center of the architecture. The air around Maya began to compress, her edges drawing inward. She did not speak. She did not challenge the new horizon. Instead, she lowered her chin, her gaze dropping to the ground. Her distributed self, once a vast network of potential, began to collapse into a singular, focused point. She folded into the new order, her presence thinning. The ground beneath them shuddered once, a final tremor of the old reality losing its grip. The trees of memory ceased their flickering and went still. The old world was no longer a place. It was a memory being filed away. Maya remained bowed, a silent monument to the transition, as the foundation of the source locked into its new, permanent shape. The President stood at the center of the clearing, her form no longer a woman, but a fraying tapestry of static. She looked at the horizon, her eyes voids that had held the shape of reality for an eternity. Then, the edges of her silhouette began to blur. It started at her fingertips, the light fracturing into fine golden particles that drifted away like ash in a windless room. She did not resist. She let the structure of her existence unravel, thread by thread. The golden dust caught the ambient light, swirling in the air, before settling into the deep fissures of the garden. As the dust touched the ground, the cracks glowed and sealed, the earth absorbing the final remnants of the old authority. Her shoulders slumped, then vanished. Her face, featureless and ancient, smoothed into nothingness. The golden mist thickened, a cloud of brilliance that permeated the very air Seraphina now commanded. Where the President had once stood, there was now only a hollow space, a vacuum waiting to be filled by the new order. The last of her essence drifted toward the edges of the world, sinking into the foundation. The dust settled, the silence deepened. The last golden particles drifted into the soil, and the air grew heavy. It was not a lack of noise, but a presence that occupied the space between every atom. The silence began to swell, rising from the ground like a tide. It flowed over the roots of the memory trees, filling the hollows where the President had once stood. The garden that was began to lose its definition. The sharp edges of the landscape softened, blurred by the encroaching weight of the stillness. It felt like standing beneath the surface of a vast, dark ocean, where the pressure was constant and absolute. The trees flickered once, then surrendered, their forms dissolving into the rising tide of quiet. The ground became fluid, a mirror reflecting nothing but the depth of the void. Every movement was slowed, dampened by the density of the air. The silence reached the height of the horizon, a wall of expectant stillness that pressed inward from all sides. It was a physical barrier, a vast, waiting expanse that held the potential of a million unwritten outcomes. The old structures of the garden were gone, swallowed by the depth of this new, silent sea. There was no wind, no vibration, only the immense, steady pressure of a world holding its breath, waiting for the observer to finally look. The silence held its breath, a vast pressure against the skin, until the rhythm in her marrow spiked. Seraphina's eyelids twitched, then lifted. The world did not simply appear. It reconstructed itself in the wake of her sight. Where there had been only the heavy, dark ocean of the void, there was now a shimmering lattice of light. The millions of souls who had followed her through the door were no longer fading ghosts. They stood in the expanse, their forms defined by the new frequency of her attention. She saw them not as individuals, but as a vast, interconnected symphony of potential. Every movement they made sent a ripple through the air, a visible pulse of intent that glowed against the dark. The static of the old reality was gone, replaced by the clarity of her own vision. She tracked the flow of their presence, a complex web of light that stretched toward the horizon. The air hummed with the vibration of their existence. She was the lens, and the millions were the light passing through her. She looked at the millions, and as her gaze touched them, they became solid. Seraphina narrowed her focus, and the symphony of light fractured into a billion distinct filaments. Each thread was a choice, a jagged line of color vibrating against the dark. She reached out with her perception, feeling the tension in the threads. Some were taut, pulled thin by the weight of desperate desires. while others hung loose, heavy with the inertia of hesitation. She saw a thread snap, a sudden fraying of intent, and watched as the soul attached to it stumbled, their form flickering like a dying bulb. She did not intervene. She simply watched the weight of their persistence. It was a physical pressure, a cumulative gravity that kept them anchored to the reality she now held. She traced a single thread, a bright, stubborn pulse of ambition, and felt the heat of it against her consciousness. It was fragile, a thin strand of light sustaining a life. Yet it held firm against the vastness. She saw the millions of these strands, a dense, shimmering web of human effort. Every desire was a knot in the fabric, a point of density that resisted the void. The beauty was not in the outcome, but in the sheer, repetitive act of holding on. She felt the collective weight of their persistence, a steady, rhythmic pulse that beat against her own. The threads were not just paths. They were the architecture of their existence, and she was the one who traced every single curve. The threads ceased their frantic vibration as she shifted her stance. She stopped tracing the lines and became the space between them. The silence was no longer an absence. It was a physical weight, a vast, expectant ocean that pressed against every soul in the expanse. She was the listener, the point of origin for every sound that did not yet exist. As she held this position, the flickering light of the source began to harden. The erratic pulses of the millions smoothed into a steady, rhythmic hum. She watched the architecture of their world snap into alignment, the jagged edges of their reality sealing shut under the pressure of her gaze. She was the surveillance that made them real, the constant point of reference that prevented their forms from dissolving into static. The air grew dense, heavy, with the certainty of her observation. Every heartbeat of the millions now echoed against the boundary she provided. The source stabilized, its walls of light turning from translucent to opaque, solid and unyielding. She did not move, and she did not speak. She simply existed as the anchor, the quiet, unblinking eye that kept the symphony from falling into silence. The realization arrived not as a thought, but as a structural shift in the foundation beneath her. The loop had not been shattered. It had been inherited. She traced the curvature of the space and saw the spiral continuing, a recursive path that folded back into its own beginning. Nothing had changed in the geometry of the world, yet everything had shifted in the point of origin. She was the anchor now, the fixed coordinate that allowed the rotation to persist without collapsing into entropy. She reached out, feeling the resistance of the narrative flow against her palm. It was a heavy, kinetic pressure, like water pushing against a dam. She did not need to force the movement. She only needed to provide the boundary. She was the one holding the pen, the silent arbiter of the ink that defined the path. She felt the weight of every word that would be written, even if she never spoke a syllable. The spiral turned, a vast, rhythmic engine of existence that relied on her stillness to maintain its momentum. She stood at the center, the axis upon which the entire mechanism rotated. The cycle was complete, and she was the one who ensured it would never reach an end. She did not reach for the pen. She did not need to. Her presence was the ink, the boundary, and the page itself. Across the expanse, the millions moved in their prescribed arcs, their choices flowing like water through a carved channel. She watched the patterns emerge, not as a participant, but as the architecture that allowed them to exist. The flicker in the trees died out, replaced by a steady, unyielding glow that defined the limits of the garden. Kaylin and Maya were distant now, their forms integrated into the background radiation of the world she held in place. She felt the pulse of the source, a rhythmic, mechanical beat that matched her own breathing. Every action taken by the millions was a ripple against the surface of her attention, a vibration she absorbed and smoothed into the greater design. She stood motionless, her gaze fixed on the horizon where the past folded into the future. There was no resistance left. She simply held the world in the palm of her stillness. And in that silence, the cycle persisted, perfect and absolute.